19 are anticipated coming off of 99. So that's our main access to the site. And the configuration you have here is the anticipated stacking and queuing that will take place in the peak hour. And you'll notice on this next slide that when we have 6.7 feet here, and that is at this specific point. The narrowest point is right here where the sidewalk kind of encroaches onto the property, but at nowhere along the frontage does it get less than 5 feet. So 5 feet is kind of the maximum, but the reason I'm pointing this out is because in the outer highway commercial area of the downtown overlay, it's very automobile focused, and having this setback, this curb setback, allows for circulation of the site during peak hours.
Let me stop you there for a minute. What you're showing on the screen I don't believe matches with any of the maps that you gave to us, unless I'm, oh, maybe it's this one. It's on the back of this page. Okay.
Apologize.
So we had a few different ones, one showing 15 all the way across, one showing 8.9 in a narrow, and 1.25. So are those not what you're proposing now, and it's going to be?
We'll go through all those. I'm just explaining why we submitted this originally.
Okay.
And that is to keep this circulation open during peak hours so that a car leaving the south end of the fuel station here can circle around and exit on 99 if they choose without having to go out on 2nd and still circulate with peak queuing. So as mentioned in the city's staff report, we can meet the 15-foot setback, which is the next slide, and that just goes mainly depicted to show you that 14 feet drops to 5.7 feet pretty quick, and that does not allow a car to circulate. Now this car could start to turn this way a little more, but then it starts blocking other queuing lanes and pass-by lanes, and it becomes kind of a pinch point here, is why we would request that a lesser setback there on the 15 feet. And as I was reading through the code, and this might be a gray area that you can provide some clarification for me, in the site design review under the section titled parking, where this requirement comes in, it's under a subsection called the side of building parking lot areas. And the specific code reference is 16.4150 A4B1, if you go down the list. And the subsection states side of building parking areas. Parking shall be permitted between a building and an interior lot line that is not a rear lot line, provided the following standards are met. And the first number one under that says, parking and maneuvering areas shall be set back a minimum of 15 feet from the front lot line. To me, that reads only specifically when you would like parking between a building and a side lot line, which is not the case here. And with this fuel center, this was one of the main areas why we tried to get into the outer highway commercial, because of the setback requirements for the structure. And so maybe that could be some interpretation we get from you, because to me that specifically applies to when you have a building and a side lot line with parking in between, which is not the case in this instance. And so that's why we would propose, and we'd prefer to have the minimal 5 foot, which gets wider as you head to the northeast, is where we would prefer to be, because it allows more circulation on the site, since the site is more auto-oriented, as with the outer highway commercial district. Now, we've been trying to find a way to bat this back and forth and meet everybody's requirements, and we have a proposal that might work. We would prefer the much narrower 5 to 6 foot landscape buffer, but we tried to leave an option open where we could balance the landscaping with circulation as much as possible, and that would be the next slide that you have there. This dotted line is the 15-foot setback line, to give you a point of reference, with additional landscaping on one side, less landscaping on the other, which allowed for more circulation. Now, we would prefer the 5 to 6 feet, but this is an option, and to show you there kind of the balance of the landscape on one side and the other as compared to the 15-foot setback line. And this is the additional slide that's been added as kind of an option. It's not our preferred option, but it's an option to try and meet the code as it's written. Any questions on the setbacks for considering what we just discussed? Chew on that for a minute. We can move forward into this.
So, yeah, let me ask you on that. If that 15-foot, if there's not, I guess I'll call it the wavy option here. If the wavy option wasn't approved, would that, how would that affect? Would you guys be able to move forward with if it was 15 feet directly across there all the way? Or does that cut off one of your lanes?
In that
or?
option. It just
Yeah.
provides, with the stacking as shown here, with the exhibit that our traffic engineer helped us with, it really minimizes, kind of creates a choke point there where it doesn't allow a car to circulate around it in peak times. It can be done, but since we're going with the Type 3 land review, we thought we'd ask for an interpretation to better circulate the site. The intent of the outer highway is for automotive use, and this is an automotive concern, and so we thought we would present that to you for consideration. So if there are no more questions, we can move forward and discuss that later. So after the site development standards, the backbones of the site, we get into the site design review guidelines, which is architectural in nature and really focused on the look and the feel of the development. And as was mentioned, and we won't bring it up in the staff report, there are a lot of items that don't particularly apply to us. We tried to go through and get the things that we could incorporate into our design and include those. Typically, Fred Meyer's design is platinum on red, and we've gone to a neutral color to meet your color requirements and to meet your color palette that you desire in the city. We've added a cornice to the top of the canopy. Typically, it's just flat to kind of add a capping element, which is another item in there. We've wrapped the columns in the kiosk in stone and added a text coat to the columns and the canopy. It's almost like a stucco finish to provide some texture as required in the material guidelines, and get the distinct base, middle, and top requirements that are pointed out in the site design review guidelines. These are actually accurate elevations. This is how it will look from Locust Street if you're looking into the site. This will be the side that faces the properties to the west of us. And this elevation here is actually from 2nd, and this will be from 99E. This is a blow-up of the mechanical kiosk, and as you can see, there's no markings or anything. There'll just be 2 doors. And the signage here brings us to the last thing. We talked a lot about the signage in the staff report, so the only thing that I'll add is the intent of our signs are to provide as much information as we can to our clients. Unlike a drive-through in a restaurant, you can get to the board and stop and think a minute. When you're driving down the highway is when decisions are made with fuel centers of whether you're going to stop or not. So we try to get as much information to our clients as possible. And one other thing I would add to these requirements is that fuel price signs have additional requirements placed on them by the state of Oregon. The Oregon Administrative Rule, 137-020-150 is specifically on fuel price signs, and it requires that if you list any price for any fuel that you dispense on your site, you have to list every price for every grade of fuel that you dispense. So we don't have an option of taking one of those signs off. We have to have all 4 or we don't have any. And so there are additional requirements placed by the state of Oregon, which makes our signs bigger, which conflict with a lot of the sign regulations. And so in your consideration of allowing those signs, I would ask you to consider that as well, that these do have additional requirements that a typical sign doesn't have on it placed by the state of Oregon. Any questions on what we discussed here on the materials, colors, site design guidelines?
What's your position on where the measurement should take place? Have you dealt with this in other places?
Not particularly, but when I read the code, I came away with the same thing as you. If it was a building, we would be well away from meeting the limit because of going from the ground up. But I've seen it done just the canopy face as well, depending on the jurisdiction. So it's kind of a gray area in the code here, but I've seen it done both ways.
Are you aware of any code provisions in any, whether it's the state or in Canby, that would say that canopy is a building?
No, from the code that the way I've interpreted it, it would be interpreted as a structure, because I think the definition of a building has to do with habitation or, I have the definition here, I can look it up if you'd like, but it's, the way I came away with it is it was a structure and not a building, the canopy.
Go ahead.
So I'd like to revisit the parking issue, because I understand that it's been stated that meets our code. And I guess where's I've been digging through here for a while, and obviously it doesn't call out, at least I have not seen where it calls out a fuel station or a fuel island or a fuel facility of any sort. And so how are we coming to the conclusion as to what's the minimum parking?
There's a general square footage requirement in there, and because the canopy is a structure and not a
Right.
building, the two kiosks, the mechanical and restroom, and then the kiosk under the canopy become your square footage, and it's only 330 square feet, I believe, give or take, which I think it comes out to be one stall is required. And so we add the one stall, we add in an ADA stall to meet that requirement, and we've met the city standard.
So, and the reason I bring this up is most of these call out 1,000 square feet of floor area, leasable area, and then the others, which without any other definition, I would say this falls under, it's one space per 550 square feet. Doesn't call out
Per
a
employee.
floor area or a floor footprint. And my concern, to be clear, is that kind of what Chuck was discussing, is you got two spots for, you know, I don't know, 2, 3, 4 employees, street parking. Well, we've already brought up the transportation issues with the buses and things along those lines, and I don't know what the parking issues are on that street as it is, so to push more onto that street causes me a little concern there. And I'm not sure if what your guys' interpretation in regards to city staff was in regards to the footprint size, but the square footage of the lot's more than 1,100 feet. And that, I mean, that's, I don't know if I'm off base there or if that's out of the norm, but that's the way I read that, is that's, the
Typically,
omission tells me that it's not a floor footprint, it's a, what's the word I'm looking for? Not acreage, but a lot size.
I've never seen it based on lot size. It's always been footprint. Like if you're doing a Fred Meyer store, it would be the 120,000 feet of the store, not the 4 or 5 acres that the site encompasses.
Yeah, pretty big
It's-
parking garage.
Yeah. And so that's I've never seen it done on the site size before. It's always footprint. And again, this is a gray area. It doesn't, with the canopy,
Right.
yeah.
I'm looking at it more just from the practicality side of it.
I understand. If there aren't any questions, I'll go to the last slide we have, and that deals with actually, we have our monument sign, but we've talked about that already. We're adding the the stone to the bottom of the sign here to kind of wrap it in, the same thing we're using on all the canopies and the kiosks and the columns and the across the site to kind of wrap it all together.
Is your numbering going to be, is it going to be electronic or is it going to be manual?
It's electronic. It's all through the kiosk. It's done. And so the final slide here is just landscaping. It'll be a vast improvement over what's there. I think we're going from 3 to 4 trees to over 19 is what's proposed. There are hundreds of plantings, shrubs, grasses. There's no grass that's going to be used on site. It's going to be rock mulch, low flow type irrigation. And so it should be a great product. They turn out really well when they're done. I don't know if there are any questions on landscape, but that's it for me if there aren't. And
Are you the last one presenting on behalf of the applicant?
I think the traffic engineer has some things to address.
Then let me ask you this question, because I don't think the traffic engineer will be the one that you want answering this question.
Okay.
Strikes me, if this were to be approved with staff's findings, or at least some of staff's findings, if you have the staff report on page 18 and page 20, there's 2 particular places where the staff has asked for, I think, what are wise things, in my opinion, to submit a revised lighting plan and on each one. And I would suggest that if we were to use those findings, we would say submit and use a revised lighting plan. Would you have any objection to that you can think of?
No, the particular comments for the lighting plan deal with recessed lighting under the canopy, and they are recessed. They're LED. They're up under, flush with the canopy. They don't hang down. So I don't have a problem with those addition because that's what we do.
And the other thing, actually, I missed it. It had to do with the sign, the monument sign. So you
Yeah.
guys had it on the bottom, but I believe the code calls for it to be, as Angie was talking about, to be pretty much wrapped around. Is there any specific reason as why we avoided that, or?
To be honest with you, it's just the way they're manufactured. I mean, these are pretty standard. We could always wrap it
Right.
with stone or whatever, but the actual portion that's in the black case is
Right.
pretty,
Standardized?
yeah. So, and I think if you look at the dimensions, this is pretty maxed out as well. So I'd have to contact the manufacturer and see if they make the smaller signs to compress it to get a border around it if it was necessary.
Right.
Yeah, I've been enforcing the code, the new sign code, since we put it in place, and basically it's this idea of a distinct base, middle, and top that it's asking for more so than a surrounding frame. And so what this is missing is a top, unless you want to say that somehow or other above the numbers, the Fred Meyer thing is a top, but it's not really distinct. That all seems to be one thing to me, and so it's kind of missing a distinct top cap, more so than a frame around it. The code also provides you the authority to, and even in some cases for the planning director, to waive those three distinctions if unusual
I think
circumstances
the
or
wording is
something.
if it's timeless and has a sense of structure.
Right. It's looking for,
Looks solid.
yeah, it's looking for a substantial-looking monument sign that's attractive. And so, there's where you have some ability to decide whether that monument sign is attractive enough or whether it needs specifically a distinguishing feature as such as a top cap.
Where are we with height? What's the height requirement? Are we capped out on height?
I believe it's 9 feet.
Yeah, we are at 9 feet.
Can't remember, does it say anything about a minimum base height and all that kind of stuff in there?
I think it says 48 square feet per face is where the limiting, if you're 9 feet, then that limits your width to whatever 48 square feet would be.
I saw it, there you go, too.
Any other questions for me, or should we turn the time over to Brent Aaron?
Unless there's any questions, let's move on.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Brent Arend. I'm a traffic engineer with Group McKenzie. The address is 1515 Southeast Water Avenue, Suite 100 in Portland. So I'll try to be brief. I know we're spending a lot of time on this, and some of these items I think will come up during the opponent's testimony as well, and we can cover a little bit of this during the rebuttal as well. But some of the key points I wanted to mention to you in regards to the traffic analysis I'll cover now. So those of you that went through the boundary adjustment in the prior hearing process know the TPR issue came up, and that was addressed during that process. So now is really the time where we address the traffic impacts of the proposed fuel facility, and it's proper to talk about what were the traffic study requirements, what did it find, those sorts of items. So when at the pre-app, the process for determining the scope of the traffic study, what we need to look at is determined by the city and their consultant engineer, which is DKS. And after the pre-app, DKS consulted with ODOT and city staff, came back with the scope of the traffic study that we needed to prepare. We had a little bit of back and forth with some of our assumptions, trip generation, the distribution of those trips, et cetera, and came to an agreement prepared a traffic study. They asked for a little more information, which had to do with the vehicle queuing and circulation on site, which Jake presented the queuing map, and that was based on a survey of 2 other Fred Meyer fuel facilities, where we actually went out and observed what those peak queues were, how many in each lane, and we looked at sites that were bidirectional, not one way, so we could kind of see if there's an imbalance, and that's how we came up with that estimate for this site, how many vehicles, the 19 vehicles that would be queued at the site during that peak time. So I point out that for the access to Highway 99, we had to submit an approach application with ODOT. They reviewed that. They approved the full movement access. And as was mentioned by staff, they're agreeable to the language that at some point in the future it could be limited to right in, right out if needed. And we understand that a median would probably be installed at that time. We don't have any issue with that if that were to happen in the future. The city's consultant DCAS, as I mentioned, they reviewed and accepted the analysis, and their July 17th memo, which is part of this packet, states their recommendations. I mentioned that we worked out trip generation with them, and the trip generation was based on surveys of existing Fred Meyer fuel facilities, specifically at Sandy and Oak Grove on McLaughlin there. And what we found was that compared to what the standard trip generation rates are in the trip generation manual, the Fred Meyer fuel facility has a little bit less in the AM, but more in the PM. So we went ahead and used the higher of both the PM and the AM as a worst case analysis in the traffic study. And the analysis was found to meet the requirements of both ODOT and the city. Let's see, the left turn issue for left turns on 99E, again, ODOT reviewed it and approved it, and the condition as proposed currently would allow a restriction to right in, right out if problems did develop in the future. However, I'd point out that the city's consultant DKS in their memo notes that left turn conflicts would be infrequent. And they also pointed out that the city has a plan for a left turn, or excuse me, a pedestrian refuge, and originally it was intended to be on this site frontage side of Locust. Whether or not that happens in the future is yet to be seen, but there is a concept for pedestrian refuge there. And if that were to go in, it would also restrict left turns. The last point I wanted to make real quick was in regards to traffic impacts on Second. So there's some question as to whether a neighborhood through trip study is needed. And the way I interpret it is one is required when you add trips through a neighborhood. Now, Second is the boundary between commercial and residential. So I think that it's a stretch, I think, to call it going through a neighborhood. It's adjacent to a neighborhood. And Second has to serve both the commercial and the residential uses on both sides. And the second point is the NTTS is required only when trips don't have a destination or origin in the neighborhood. And I would argue that trips to and from the fuel facility do have a destination in the neighborhood. So they're not considered through trips anyway, that they have to drive on Second to get here. So I'll be happy to answer any questions you might have about traffic issues.
I have a real problem with this traffic dumping on Second Street, because that is bordered on neighborhood area, and behind them is a lot of apartments and stuff like that. And another problem I see happening is that when people find out it's such a problem to make a left-hand turn out, they're going to use Second Street to go down to Ivy and try to make a left-hand turn out there. I mean, I drive a bus, and I do that now a lot because you can't get out off the Locust. And I see that that's going to be a real problem of all these people that want to go west will go out to Second Street and go down to Ivy, and Ivy is our big bottleneck right now. People trying to make a left-hand turn to get on to 99. And I see this as a real problem. This is my biggest problem, is the traffic with this whole thing in this neighborhood and all the people that's behind that, because there's a lot of people from those apartments come down to Second Street and go across and cut across to go over to Thriftway and stuff. And I see it's a real problem with dumping traffic on Second Street. I have a real problem with this.
Okay, it certainly will add some traffic to Second Street, but I don't think it's as many trips as some people fear. It sounds like a lot, but it's not really compared to what's there today.
Any other questions? Thank you.
Okay, I think Lee wanted to come up and make a closing statement.
Okay, let's keep it short. We've already given you a long time.
Thank you very much for your indulgence. Lee Layton for the record. There are just two things I wanted to offer to you. One is on the subject of the landscaping. I think it would be helpful to view these landscape widths from the standpoint, we look at these things in plan, but in fact, none of us experiences our community from, directly up above. We experience our community from, in this instance, moving along Highway 99. So when you look at this landscape island, if you're traveling from left to right in this instance, generally north, you'll see that 15-foot wide landscape strip. You'll be able to make out the width of it. In this design, with the right plantings extending to that 25-foot or so mark from the front property line or the sidewalk, in fact, if you think about the view angle for somebody traveling along the highway, that landscape area is going to look from that angle almost twice as wide. And the area that's paved behind it is going to be invisible because it's hidden behind it. And so this is making an accommodation within the site that will make the traffic movements operate better. But from a visual standpoint, the experience of going by on the highway, this can be made to look like the landscaping is actually wider than it is. And I think that'll be the dominant popular perception of it. The only other point I wanted to make is, and this is sort of embedded in the traffic analysis, Brent's work was based on actual surveys of customers at Fred Meyer who, at a very high proportion, buy their fuel on the same trip when they have been going to the store. So when it comes to the question of whether restrooms are available, there's a very large share of people we anticipate will be using this station that have either just come from the store where there's an indoor restroom within the store, or they're on their way there because there's so many shared trips. That's all I have.
Thank you. Are there any other proponents? No other proponents. If there's no proponents, we'll close it to proponents and we'll move to the opponents. If you're an opponent. Please don't tell me that whole stack is for us to be handed out right now.
It is, but I'm going to summarize it, and it's not all new material. For the record, my name is Mike Connors with the law firm Hathaway Kobach Connors. I'm here on behalf of Save Downtown Canby, who's a group of local business owners who have raised some questions and concerns regarding this proposal. In the record, you hopefully have seen 3 different letters that we introduced in the text amendment zone change process. I asked you to look at those carefully because when this started out, we assumed that these were 2 consolidated applications and we were addressing both. And then whether it was your city or the applicant decided to bifurcate them and only go with the text amendment. But a lot of the material that we've raised is still relevant. We're relying on that. And looks like it's in the record, but I'll just formally request that all 3 of those letters be part of the record. So we've raised all these issues, and to date, Fred Myers, the applicant, has predominantly responded to issues that we've raised on the text amendment zone change, taking the position that site plan process hasn't really started. We'll deal with that later. So quite frankly, we were very surprised not to see anything submitted by them in response to the issues we raised, in particular traffic. For those of you who were here when there was the vote on the text amendment and zone change, a number of the commissioners expressed concern regarding the traffic, specifically stating that they had serious doubts about the methodology and the conclusions in the traffic impact analysis. And I guess I just expected that when they hear those kind of concerns, you would get something more than the traffic engineer just testifying briefly about their analysis, not really responding to the specific issues that we raised. With me here tonight is our traffic engineer, who's already submitted 2 letters as part of our earlier material, Mike Ard with Lancaster Engineering. I'm going to ask him to come up briefly after I go through a number of these items and just briefly describe some of the questions and concerns that we see with the traffic impact analysis. But before I do that, I want to focus on really some of the issues that came up in the staff report, because again, we expected some kind of submittal from the applicant responding to some of the issues. We didn't get that, but we did get a staff report that raised some additional revisions or new issues, and that's what this letter is intended to provide. So I'm going to go ahead and hand this out now. Mike, can you?
Go ahead, please bring them up. Give it to us during the hearing.
So again, some of this is based on information issues that we've already raised, but this letter is just specifically intended to respond to the revised staff report, which was introduced about a week ago. So first of all, I want to address development standards. The applicant and the staff report take the position that they acknowledge that there are a number of development standards, and these are the standards for the DCO overlay in 1641050, that a number of those standards don't apply because the particular proposal here has such small buildings that these standards aren't applicable. As we explained previously, and again a little bit more thoroughly in this January 28th letter, we don't think that the code supports that. Unlike the design review standards, where there are, for some of them, a mechanism for proposing alternatives and arguing that you meet the intent and you have some flexibility, that is not the case for the development standards. The development standards are mandatory. The development standards apply to any development that is proposed, not exceptions for a fuel station, not exceptions even for a proposal that has a smaller building area. In fact, one of the problems with the interpretation is that one of the development standards is a minimum floor area ratio requirement, meaning that you have to have a certain percentage of the site developed with a building in order to meet that requirement. And in the outer highway commercial standard, that's 25%, which roughly works out to about 8,000 plus square feet of building area. So I don't think you can say that a standard that requires for this sized property a minimum floor area, building floor area of 8,000 plus square feet is not applicable because the proposed buildings are so small. Secondly, I think, and this pertains not only to the development standards but also to a number of issues that you've raised, is what is a building? There were a lot of questions about that. How does this apply? And I think what the applicant's position is that it only applies to the restroom and the kiosk and et cetera, not the canopy. Well, I've quoted in the letter here the definitions on page 2 of a building. And part of that definition is that it has to be a structure, and I think the applicant has already indicated in their testimony, they agree it's a structure. So then you look at the definition of a building. A building is defined as a structure built for the shelter or enclosure of persons, animals, chattels, or property of any kind. Well, what is the whole purpose of a canopy in this case but to provide shelter for the patrons who come to the facility and for the equipment, the fuel area, the whole thing? I mean, that's the whole purpose for the canopy. So it clearly meets the plain language definition of a building in this case. And so there are a number of standards. I talked about the minimum floor area. There's the street lot minimum setback that requires a certain percentage of the building be within the minimum setback area for this particular zone, and the requirement in this overlay sub-area is 40%. They have 0%. So here you have a mandatory standard, a number of them that they acknowledge that they haven't met, and the only explanation that you've heard is, well, these buildings are so small they don't apply. And we just don't think that there's any language in the code that supports that interpretation. And Mr. Layton talked about the fact that the overlay criteria are not intended to prohibit uses in the base zone. Regardless of whether that's true or not, the development standards here specifically say that the overlay design standards and the development standards supersede the base zone standards. So here you've got a code provision that says to the extent there's any conflict, the overlay standards control. So they haven't met, by their own acknowledgement, a number of the development standards that we've laid out in our letter. The next issue is the design, site and design review standards. And there are some that there is an alternative mechanism, but there are some that are mandatory. And on a number of the mandatory ones, they've either acknowledged that they don't meet them or haven't really demonstrated how they meet them. And to the extent that some are alternative standards, they haven't even described how they meet the intent. I mean, really the response is that if they don't comply, it's not applicable. Or if they don't comply, just go with what they want. But that's not the same as demonstrating that they've met the intent of this sub-area. And it's important to understand that although there is an auto-oriented focus, I mean, these design standards are intended to ensure that you have quality design and development for each development that is in this area. And that's what the whole purpose for the standards is, to set a baseline and make sure that the downtown area meets a certain quality that the city has determined when it adopted these standards. The mandatory standards are the ones found in that table that staff referred to. And the numbers that staff was talking about tonight were the first that I've heard of those numbers, because if you look in the staff report, they come up with particular numbers that we think, based on their own calculations, show that they don't meet the criteria. In fact, how they determine that they do meet it is by rounding the numbers, but they rounded it the wrong way. If you look at the staff report, the overall standard is 28.7. The LID standards is 16.15. They got 28 on the overall and 6 on the LID. They're below the minimum. You don't round the minimum standards down. You have to exceed or meet those minimum standards. We've also described in a number of areas where we believe that the applicant and staff have indicated that certain standards are inapplicable or were given different scores that we just don't think the evidence in the record justifies. And a big one, of course, that you need to figure out is the parking. Here we have, based on the definition of a building that I just read a second ago, a canopy that's over 5,000 square feet. So you're going to have to work through that issue, but clearly they've got an issue there, and it's going to require that there be some recalculation. And I guess I would like to see at some point in the process before the record closes how staff arrived at the new numbers, so we can understand and figure out to what extent there are still issues or, you know, different calculations that we arrived at that we've got to factor in. One of the important things that we've included in this letter, and the big reason that it's so thick, and that's the good news, is my letter's only 6 pages, and some of you may have seen that. But for those commissioners who were here during the text amendment and zone change process, there's a big conversation about the pedestrian refuge island, which we raised, hey, that's a problem. Nobody's accounted for it. Nobody's said how that's going to impact the traffic flows. And the response that we heard is, well, that hasn't been adopted. Well, it has now. The City Council adopted the Gateway Design Plan that specifically calls out, and we've noted where in the design plan page and underlined it to make it real easy, that a pedestrian island refuge is proposed in this area. And in fact, you see that in that condition 14 where they talk specifically about it. Nobody has evaluated that. Nobody from ODOT, nobody from your city traffic engineer's office, nobody from the applicant's traffic engineering firm has addressed what's going to be the impact of having a pedestrian refuge island that has now been approved. So that's a big issue that we think is deficient. We talked a lot about the signage issue. I won't go into that other than I think you're correct that they don't meet the letter of the code, and as we've explained in some of our previous submittals and this one here, we don't believe that the justifications that they've given for deviating from those are sufficient. They can meet those standards. They're just choosing not to because they have a particular sign design that they like. Well, so does the city, and I think the city should enforce those particular standards. The last issue that I'll touch on briefly, and then I'll ask Mr. Ard to come up, is traffic. And again, I want to emphasize that this was an issue that is a big concern for my client. And you've even heard from some other folks in the community that have concern about traffic, and some of the commissioners expressed that concern in some of the previous proceedings. And these aren't small issues. These are issues about them taking discounts for what they called shared trips, which Mr. Ard will explain a little bit more, but really those are trips that assume that if you're going to go to Fred Meyer, you go to the store and then you go to the gas station and do all your trips in one. It's a shared trip. Well, there's a big problem when you have a fuel station that's half a mile down the road because you're entering and exiting two sites. We presented evidence of one of their Cornelius stores that show the traffic counts at that fuel station were significantly higher than the ones that they are relying on in this case. We've demonstrated that your code requires that they consider a scoping area of a half mile from the site. They haven't done that. All they've looked at is the traffic impacts in the immediate area. And you have streets, intersections like Highway 99 and Pine and Ivy that are already either failing or close to failing, and you have no information as to what this particular proposal is going to do to those intersections. There's nothing in the record. And your code requires that they provide a study that shows the impacts within a half-mile area of the site. What's important to understand, too, is that these are not just comments that either I or Mr. Ard have just sort of come up with on their own. Some of these are comments that are in the communications from both your city engineer and from ODOT. And in fact, Mr. Ard spoke with some of the representatives there to get some clarification on that, and they said, yeah, no, that's what we expected to be the case, and if that's not the case, I guess that's not what our understanding was. Now, these are all conversations that have occurred subsequent to ODOT's approval of the access, which was in August 2012, and your city engineer's comments, which were in July of 2012. And we've raised these concerns, and Mr. Ard has talked about conversations he's had with some of those representatives, and none of those representatives have weighed in on it. They haven't seen our material. From the record that you have, they haven't seen or commented on our material, all their decisions. What's that?
We just got the material today, correct?
No, these are traffic analysis.
Okay.
So we submitted traffic material, and that's important. I'm glad you asked for that clarification because some of the commissioners don't know this. We submitted a traffic analysis or report, or response, I should say. I should be careful how I say that. Response to the traffic analysis that the applicant submitted on September 24th and October 1st.
and outlining some of the key concerns that Mr. Ard had that he's going to talk about briefly here. Those are all things that occurred after the city engineer and ODOT reviewed the information, so you don't even have a response from them. I guess we expected that they would be more engaged, and the city engineer and ODOT would be asked to weigh in to determine, is this an issue or not? From our understanding, it is, both on their communications prior to the completion of the traffic impact analysis, as well as Mr. Ard's communication with them. And so those are serious issues. And traffic is always one of those ones that, you know, you have a tendency when there's two sides in this to say, do I want the development or do I not want the development? You're kind of choosing sides. Well, traffic's different, because even if you want this development, even if you think it complies with the applicable criteria, you want to make sure that whatever impacts it's going to cause to the transportation system are evaluated and accounted for, and whatever improvements are necessary to accommodate it are on Fred Meyer's nickel, not on the city's. So with that, I'm going to ask Mr. Ard to come up and just briefly kind of go through some of Let me pause you for a that. second here. I've heard what you said, but I haven't heard on our code, chapter 160080150, that our code requires that the mitigation measures of any impacts to be adequate and feasible. I haven't heard you address that yet, that somehow that the mitigation that was proposed was not adequate and feasible. I've heard a lot of other things, but can you address that?
Sure. Basically, there is very little, if any, mitigation proposed at all. Before you can determine what mitigation is necessary, you have to evaluate all the impacts. You have to make sure that the amount of traffic is accurate. We've raised questions about that. And you have to make sure that the scope of the area that you're studying includes the entire half-mile area, which brings up some of these critical intersections. So as an applicant, they have the burden of proof to do that. What we're saying is they haven't met that minimum threshold. They haven't studied the area that they're required to study. They haven't taken into account the full extent of the traffic impacts. And until they do that, we can't really get to that conversation about the mitigation is. It's not our job to provide for them what mitigation. It's their job to do a proper study, and then once we have that study, for us to comment on it, for your staff to comment on it, and for you to determine what, if any, mitigation is necessary to mitigate those impacts.
Is it your position that the opponents don't have any burden of presenting any impacts that need to be mitigated?
Well, we have presented evidence. We presented evidence that showed that they're underestimating the amount of traffic.
Underestimating the amount of traffic is not an impact.
Well, underestimating the amount of traffic and failing to evaluate intersections that your own transportation system plan is showing is either at or near the threshold requirement. Okay. And so we think that that's sufficient at a minimum. Quite frankly, I don't even know that that's necessary. I mean, the applicant has a burden, but that's more than sufficient to show that there's a very likely or feasible chance that they are going to cause intersections to exceed the threshold. And it's up to them, as the applicant proposing this development with the burden of proof, to show that. And if that's not the case, then that's part of their case. But they haven't even done that minimum.
So since we're talking about the traffic stuff, maybe it'll be better for the traffic engineer, but I'm slightly confused as to where you guys view as the impacts being inadequate, because if it's on 99E, correct me if I'm wrong, and this might be where we get into that weird world of ODOT having precedence over certain roads, is that with ODOT providing a permit, we somewhat have our hands tied on 99E, correct? I'm looking at anybody who's done that before.
I'll answer that. And then I don't know if you want your staff to answer that first, or, but I can answer that. Do you want me to answer it?
Yeah, go ahead.
So ODOT's permit thus far has just been for access. ODOT doesn't review a separate traffic impact analysis and determine whether, you're going to exceed a threshold at this intersection. That's what this process is for. That's why your code, 1608150, requires that this study be done, and specifically requires that there be an evaluated area, and if you exceed thresholds, the applicant has to mitigate those to demonstrate that the transportation system can operate within the required threshold. ODOT doesn't have a separate process for that. ODOT just looks at the access, and that's what they've approved. So this is the last forum for somebody to look at this issue.
And I think we go with what our traffic engineer says. That's the side, the position we as staff take is going with the position of our hired traffic engineer saying that the study was sufficient.
Can you show me on the packet you gave us today where your listing or discussion of the impacts are on this?
No, these were in the September 24th and October 1st. Mr. Ard prepared two separate memorandums, one dated September 24th and the other one August 1st, that go through in detail what are the issues that he's raised.
Okay, so those were presented on the actual text amendment, and the city's already decided on that piece, is that right?
No, those were presented in the text amendment zone change proceeding, and those letters are now introduced in this one. The applicant's position in the text amendment zone change was, that's a site plan issue. We're just talking text amendment, zone change, traffic impact analysis was not even a discussion point, because that pertains to this proposed development, not the amendment. The amendment is the transportation planning rule, a TPR issue, which is a whole separate issue as to whether they were required to do that. But this traffic impact analysis is not something that was decided or even really reviewed. It wasn't even part of the record at the City Council text amendment zone change proceeding.
Okay.
Can I get Mr. Ard up here before I say anything
Go
stupid?
ahead.
Okay, thanks.
Good evening. My name is Michael Ard, PE. I'm with Lancaster Engineering. I'm a transportation engineering consultant. I've got 10 years of experience doing traffic impact studies and significant experience doing review of traffic impact studies as well. And I have actually served in the past as a consultant directly for the city of Canby, and I'm very familiar with traffic patterns and concerns within the city. I did review the study that Group McKenzie put together, and what I'd like to do to keep things as simple as possible, because there's a great deal of detail involved in my review of their study, is talk about what we know and what we don't know and what we need to know. So I'll start with what we know. The first thing that we know is that there are safety and capacity concerns on Highway 99W in the vicinity of this site, especially at the Ivy intersection, which has been identified as a high crash location. We know that the proposed development is going to add 172 new primary trips to the transportation system. That does not count the 74 additional trips that will be passing by the site and turn in and back out. Those are just the new trips attributable to this development. We know that typically ODOT requires analysis of intersections where either 25, in some instances, vehicles pass through the intersection during the peak hour, or in some instances, as many as 50 vehicles pass through the intersection. And there are several intersections along the Highway 99W corridor that will experience traffic volumes in excess of that associated with this development. We know that the City of Canby in their code requires analysis within a half-mile area, and also specifically calls out that analysis is required where traffic will go up by more than 5% associated with a proposed development. The intersection of Highway 99E at Pine Street will experience a 5% increase in traffic as a direct result of this development based on the information provided by Group McKenzie, which I believe underestimates the impacts of this development. I know from looking at data that was provided to me through the city of Cornelius that Fred Meyer gas stations generate 3 times the fuel sales of typical gas stations throughout the country. We know that Fred Meyer is unusual in the way that it generates trips, and the fact that it has special discount programs can attract higher volumes of traffic than a typical gas station. We know that Group McKenzie provided specific information related to Fred Meyer sites, but we don't know whether that specific information that was provided is actually representative of typical Fred Meyer sites, or whether it was data that was chosen in a way that would suit them. And in particular, since I only have the ability to look up independent information from a very select few jurisdictions, in particular Cornelius, I could do because they have a citywide tax that is applied, and the tax rates paid are public record. I'm aware from that that the Fred Meyer sells significantly more fuel there than the next highest gas station in town, and substantially more than average.
Question for you. In Cornelius, is that Fred Meyer fuel station attached to a retail store, or is it separate like this one would be?
I believe that it is attached. Fred Meyer may be able to answer that more directly than me. I'm not 100% sure on
detached
that.
to an attached one?
Right.
Okay.
We also know that Fred Meyer took a shared trip reduction for this site, and I want to talk a little bit about what a shared trip is before I discuss the problems with the way that they took that reduction. A shared trip reduction is something that we very commonly do in traffic impact studies when we have more than one use that's proposed on a single site. If I'm doing a large-scale development that has an office complex and a restaurant right in the same parking lot, I can assume that some of the people from that office might go to the restaurant. Or if I have a gym or a residential neighborhood with a convenience store located in it, I can assume that some of those trips are just going to stay internal to the street system, that they won't leave out into the larger community. And we have data in the ITE Trip Generation Handbook that describes how many trips we should be reducing and in what circumstances. In this situation, Fred Meyer's not relying on that data, and I think it's appropriate that they don't. They used very specific data that was gathered from Fred Meyer sites. But the problem is they gathered that data from sites where the gas station is on the same property as the store, which is what's typical of an internal trip. It isn't really internal if you leave the site, travel on a public road, and then go into another site. It's just a dual trip. But there are a number of problems that arise from that. Number one is the really obvious one, that the reduction that they're taking where you have the two developments within a single site represents really the maximum internal capture that can happen. It's convenient to visit both of those uses at the same time, and people do. When that convenience goes down because the sites are separated by a half mile, the percentage of people who make the conjoined trip also goes down. Just because I happen to be going to Fred Meyer one day or a gas station one day doesn't necessarily mean that I'm going to go a half mile out of my way to visit the other because they're owned by the same corporate entity. Worse than that, though, this study actually projects more traffic making that shared trip than what they even observed. The reason is that the distribution of trips from this development was based on a planning model that included trips already going to Fred Meyer. So they have a percentage of trips that are going to that zone, and on top of that background group that was already assumed to be going there, they added this internal percentage, double counting some of those trips. So in that sense, they've really erred in using this internal capture. That concern has been echoed by the other traffic engineers that have reviewed this, including Chris Majeski of DKS Associates and Avi Tayar of ODOT, who, when I talked to him after reviewing the study and talked specifically about the internal capture, he reiterated what he had said and what was listed in the record. His letter was on page 295 of the packet material. But that he had instructed Group McKenzie specifically to use the standard methodologies for the pass-by and trip rates associated with the site, and he did not want to see any internal capture for this development. Now, moving on from what we know to questions, what we don't know. The applicant's representative, when he first sat down, said that they were here to answer your questions tonight. And these are the questions that I think you should be asking. Number one, is the trip generation that you used typical of Fred Meyer sites? I don't think that we have a good answer to that. There is a way to get a good answer to that. We can request data from sites of the city's selection rather than just getting data